Zuera walked into the cage-maker's chamber first, and for 3 seconds she was alone with a god who wanted to eat the world. 3 seconds, the duration between the smock crossing the threshold and the trap's capture field closing around the encoding frequency. 3 seconds during which the chamber erupted with Mariama's cipher. Every node in the convergence mechanism blazing amber, every surface registering the encoding frequency that had been woven through dead hands and folded into a map and carried across the territories to this place at this moment. The smock announced itself so loudly that nothing else in the chamber could be heard. Tibijia entered 1 step behind her. His weapon was drawn, not because iron could harm an obsidian-faced shadow master, but because holding a weapon sharpened his attention to a fine edge. When Tibijia held his weapon, he noticed everything. And noticing was the only currency he had in a chamber full of forces that could unmake the world. The chamber was a workshop. The walls were carved with 1,000 years of chiefly genealogy, names spiraling inward toward the ceiling in geometric script. But the carvings were overlaid with Tohage's additions, dark lines that were not paint or carving, but corruption made visible, running across the walls in patterns that Tibijia's unenchanted eyes could not interpret, but his soldiers' instinct recognized as fortification. The cage-maker had been expecting an assault. The air smelled of old stone and hot metal, the specific scent of magic being conducted through materials not designed for it, a smell Tibijia had learned to identify during 6 days of traveling with people who bent the world in ways he could not see. Under that, something else, a mineral sweetness, like heated quartz, rising from the root lines embedded in the floor. The temperature was wrong. Cold near the floor where the root lines ran, warm near the ceiling where the alignment's energy pressed down like a lid on a pot. The sweat on Tibijia's neck chilled while the top of his head baked. The dissonance made his stomach clench. The dais held the skin, the leopard hide that Azindo's shadow had been reaching toward for a week. Even to Tibijia's unenchanted sight, the skin was visibly wrong. The surface looked right, the spots and scars of 1,000 years of ceremony. But underneath, visible as a faint shimmer of distortion in the alignment-charged atmosphere, another pattern moved. The corrupted copy, a forgery over a masterpiece. The trap fired. Tibijia could not see the capture field. It operated on frequency registers his senses could not detect, but he could feel its effect. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in less than a second. The pressure increased, not atmospheric pressure, but a different kind, a compression of the space around them, as though the chamber's walls were contracting. The sensation of being enclosed by walls that were not physical, but were oppressive. The trap was attempting to contain the encoding frequency, to redirect it into Tohage's third skin. The encoding frequency fought back. Zuera's hands were white-knuckled on the smock. She stood with the encoded textile blazing against her chest, and Mariama's extraordinary density was doing exactly what it was designed to do, choking the trap's processing capacity. The capture field could not wrap the frequency fast enough. The corrupted geometry tried, slipped, recalibrated, tried again, slipped. The smock's density was a wall of information so complex that the trap needed seconds to process it, and those seconds were the calibration window the duet required. Then Tohage emerged from the shadows. He separated from the northeastern corner of the chamber the way a figure separates from a painting, one dimension at a time, the flat darkness gaining depth and shape and menace. Tibijia's attention focused. This was what he was here for, not the frequencies. The man, the physical presence. The body that housed the cage-maker's ambition and wore half an obsidian face. Tohage was lean, military precise, the body of a former Ashvale commander who had maintained his conditioning through 20 years of corruption. The third skin added dimension, the obsidian half catching the alignment-charged light in patterns that should not have been possible in stone. Living geometry, moving reflections, simultaneously human and mineral.
"You are Mariama's daughter,"
Tohage said. His bifurcated voice, human and harmonic, flesh and stone, filled the chamber with a sound Tibijia felt in his chest cavity.
"She was the only pattern keeper who understood what I was doing."
She understood enough to die warning the world about it.
Zuera replied. Then the shield wavered. Tibijia saw it before anyone else, the advantage of eyes unclouded by system sight. The smock flickered, not the dramatic failure of a mechanism breaking down, but a stutter, a gap in the encoding density that lasted less than a second. Perhaps the strain of maintaining maximum density while confronting the man whose corruption had killed her mother. Perhaps the smock's encoding reacting to the trap's latest recalibration. Perhaps simple human exhaustion after 6 days of carrying the weight of the world in a dead woman's textile. The reason did not matter. The gap opened. The trap's capture field surged into it. The corrupted geometry found purchase on the encoding frequency, began to redirect it, began to drain the density that was keeping the calibration window open. For one terrible instant, the balance shifted. The trap was winning. The encoding was being pulled from the smock like thread from a spool, the density thinning, the shield collapsing. Zuera's face went white. Her fingers spasmed against the fabric. The muscles in her forearms were cording with the effort of holding the frequency together, and Tibijia, who had spent 12 years reading the body language of soldiers under stress, recognized the specific, unmistakable expression of someone losing a fight they could not afford to lose. Tibijia did not think. 12 years of military training do not produce thought in a crisis. They produce action. He stepped between Zuera and the dais, between the encoding frequency and the capture field. He planted himself in the gap with his weapon raised and his body blocking the path between the trap's redirect and Zuera's faltering shield. He was the man with no magic. He had no frequency. He had no fragment. He had no connection to any system, no bond with any ancestor, no communion with any earth. He was iron and flesh and 12 years of trained attention, and he put that body in the place where the magic was failing, because his body was the only thing he had to give. The encoding frequency hit him. Not the trap's corrupted version, Zuera's. Mariama's cipher. The full density of the encoding frequency passing through his flesh on its way from the smock to the capture field, and his body, unenchanted, unprotected, carrying no magical resistance of any kind, absorbed the frequency the way dry wood absorbs flame. It burned. The encoding frequency branded his forearms, the skin closest to the smock, with lines of searing heat that traced the geometric patterns of Mariama's cipher across his muscles. The pain was immediate and absolute, a burning so pure it transcended sensation and became a kind of geometry. The encoding writing itself into his flesh in patterns his eyes could not track, but his body could feel, each line a thread of fire, each intersection a note of white-hot pressure. He smelled his own skin burning, acrid, sweet, stomach-turning, mixed with the chamber's hot stone smell and the copper tang of magic in overdrive. His jaw locked, his vision blurred. The weapon in his hand, the iron blade that was his only connection to his own competence, the tool that made him something more than a man standing in a room full of forces he could not see, shook in his grip. The iron was hot. The encoding frequency had heated the metal through his grip, and the pommel burned against his palm with a secondary fire that joined the primary burning in his forearms. Every instinct demanded retreat. Every nerve screamed to step back, to drop to the floor, to roll away from the source of pain. 12 years of training had taught his body to override pain. But 12 years of training had calibrated his pain tolerance against swords and arrows and the blunt impact of combat. Not against magic. Not against frequencies that cooked his flesh from the inside out, that wrote themselves into his skin with the permanence of a brand, that marked him with patterns his mind could not read, but his body would carry forever. He held. Zuera found him. Through her panic struggle to maintain the shield, she felt the obstruction, the physical body between her and the trap, the iron and flesh barrier absorbing the encoding frequencies overflow and giving her the fraction of a second she needed. She poured her concentration back into the smock. The density surged. The gap closed. The shield reformed around them both, the pattern keeper and the soldier standing in front of her with his arms blistering, and his jaw clenched, and his weapon raised against something no weapon could cut. The calibration window held. Then the world changed. The floor blazed with amber light, WuDon's full aperture communion flooding the chamber from below. The trap's capture field, already struggling with the encoding density, was assaulted from every direction. The capture rings spun. Failed. A shadow tore across the chamber, Azindo's bridge at full alignment power. And above it all, through it all, the duet, Kofi's through the system, Zara's through the earth, their counterpoint creating a harmonic the trap could not model. Tibijia noticed what the system could not show the others. The obsidian was fighting itself. Tohage's half-stone face was the most visible expression of the conflict, but Tibijia could see it in the cage-maker's body. His human hand was trying to maintain the trap, feeding corrupted frequency into the capture fields, but the obsidian hand trembled. The living stone was responding to the reunion harmonic, to the guardian's flood, to the true enskinment bond, being told to remember. And the obsidian was remembering. Tohage fought back. He fed his own life force into the failing trap. His flesh hand bled where the obsidian edges cut him. His human face grayed, hollowed, the toll visible in real time as a man burned himself to keep his fire lit. He adapted the trap, the capture fields shifting, learning from the duet's pattern the way a skilled opponent reads an attacker's rhythm. He forced the capture field onto Kofi's conducting line. And Kofi improvised, abandoned structure, played by ear, found gaps that precision could not predict. And Tohage adapted again and again. Each adaptation cost him, but he would not stop. The obsidian fell away in larger sheets. His voice cracked. His human hand shook. But the intelligence, the deep, brilliant, dangerous intelligence that had understood the system well enough to build a cage from its own body, fought for every second of the trap's existence. Each second of the fight cost Tohage something visible. His cheekbones hollowed. His shoulders narrowed. The musculature that the third skin's vitality had maintained began to sag as the living stone's energy withdrew. He was aging in real time, not the magical aging of the bridge's toll on Azindo, but the natural, accumulated aging that 20 years of obsidian integration had suspended. The years were collecting their debt. And still he fought. With diminishing resources, with a crumbling weapon, with the desperate ferocity of a man who had staked everything on a single hand and was watching the cards turn against him one by one. The convergence did not defeat a villain. It outlasted a man who refused to quit until the material of his own transformation chose the system over him. The obsidian chose the system. The living stone recognized the reunion harmonic and rejected the corruption. The third skin shattered, not explosively, but with the quiet inevitability of a material returning to its natural state. What fell to the floor was inert, sharp, beautiful, ordinary stone. The man who remained was not the cage maker. He was Tohage, a man in his 50s, lean, precise, suddenly completely human, both eyes brown, both wet. He looked smaller, not destroyed, reduced. Tohage stared at his hands. Human hands, both of them. He turned them over slowly, as if expecting the obsidian to resurface.
I was the only one.
He said, not to anyone, to the stone at his feet, to the system that had rejected him twice, once when the enskinment found him incompatible, now when the reunification confirmed the verdict.
I was the only one who saw what needed to be done, and the system.
His voice broke, not with anger, with the raw, unprocessed grief of a second rejection.
The system I tried to save does not want me.
He fell to the floor, not from injury, from the absence of the thing that had held him up for 20 years. The grief on his face was not a villain's defeat. It was the grief of a builder watching his house reject every stone he laid. He had been wrong about the method. He had not been wrong about the problem. And the intersection of those truths was written across his newly human face in exhaustion and loss. Zueta folded Mariama's smock carefully. Her hands were steady, her eyes were wet. The last pattern, the mother's final work, the shield that had saved the convergence. Quiet now, just clothe. Tibijia sheathed his weapon. His forearms screamed. The burns were settling into something permanent, the blistered skin tightening, the geometric patterns hardening into raised welts that traced the encoding structure across his muscles. He would carry these marks for the rest of his life. The soldier with no magic, permanently branded by a magic that was not his, bearing the cipher of a dead woman's love in his flesh because he had stood in the gap when no one else could. He pulled his sleeves down. He could examine the damage later. The investigation had reached its conclusion, not the conclusion he expected, not a perpetrator in chains. The perpetrator was a weeping man on a stone floor. The victim was 1,000 years of stolen truth. The resolution was structural justice. The broken thing was fixed. Case closed, not because all questions were answered, they never would be, but because the question that had started it, who killed the weaver, had been answered by something larger than any case file could contain. The weaver was dead, the pattern lived on, the loom was whole. Tibigia stood guard in the silent chamber, his arms burning beneath his sleeves, and watched the others complete what a master weaver had started when she sat at her loom for the last time and wove a message the world was not ready to hear. He looked at his hands, still gripping the weapon, still steady despite the tremor in his forearms. The iron blade was warm from the encoding frequency's residual heat. The pommel's leather wrapping had darkened where his sweat had soaked it. His hands were the hands of a soldier, calloused, scarred from years before tonight, now carrying new scars that told a different story, not the story of a man who fought battles, but the story of a man who stood in a gap. Sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was not fight, it was hold. The world was ready now.